So in our conversation around adult development theory and the critique of Dave Snowden in particular, just quickly, let's do a quick thumbs up if you know Dave Snowden or have met Dave Snowden or have worked with him before. I just want to see how much Dave Snowden knowledge we have here in the room. Okay, so that's just under half. Okay, so half of us have met with the incorrigible, wonderful, magnificent Dave. So we'll get into a little bit of an introduction to who he is and where he's coming from. Oh, wow, Jonathan, you had to present just after him. I wonder if you were also talking in zip files or if you opened your zip files before you spoke. So for those of you that have worked with Dave, you'll know that his way of speaking is sometimes as dense as Heidegger's, which means that you really have to work to follow him all the way through. But he is also a magnificent maverick and a great thinker of our time. And he works specifically in the field of anthropocomplexity, which has to do with the use of natural science methodologies into making sense of human complexity. And he's a wonderful thinker, and he works quite on the edge of what we do in the broader field of organizational and societal change. And he has some really radical ideas. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a start. The way in which we're going to do this, as with all supervision sessions, we're just going to have a quick check-in. Then we're going to delve into who's Dave, what does he say about adult development theory, and we'll be in conversation around that all the way through. There are some people here, like Jonathan, who has written extensively in response to Dave and has presented after Dave at conferences. So Jonathan, I hope that you will come into this conversation as everyone else will as well. So our check-in question that we'll do in small breakouts. And this is before we go into the critique of adult development theory. Just a question, what have I noticed about myself when something I'm really passionate about gets criticized? And what critique of adult development theory, vertical development, different things you may want to call it, have you encountered so far? And how have you responded to that critique, not just from a mouth perspective, from a thinking perspective, but also from a heart perspective, from a body perspective, anything that comes up there. So, but please don't jump straight into the questions on critique of adult development. Stand still with your own relationship with critique a little bit before we jump in there. So we will just do a short breakout. Whoever's coming in, please mute yourselves. Thank you. I'm going to just pop you into breakouts. As people come in, I might dump someone else into the breakout with you. Let's just go. There we go. And we will have between 12 and 15 minutes in the breakout. As people come in, you'll see the small group checkout questions here. Yeah, so see you in 12 to 15 minutes. There we go. Open all rooms. Sorry, that was a bit slow. I come.
That was harsh, Lucille. That was really, really harsh. And not 12 minutes, we decided.
Okay. Revolt always early on. I'm trying to get you into the right frame of mind for engaging with Dave Snowden, which means you have to truncate, you make it more intense, and probably be left feeling slightly unsatisfied and stupid at the end of it all. Okay.
You've done that. Thank you for that.
Great. And we're going to continue the conversation in the larger group anyway. So let us hear. We're just going to ask for 3 sound bites. Either something you were mid-sentence saying that you're quite passionate about, or otherwise something that really struck you, either around personal relationship with critique, or alternatively around critique of adult development theory. So let's just get 3 sound bites. Anything that wants to come into the room? Steph. And then Nick. Wonderful.
So around personal critique, we were discussing around the how the critiquing is done, what is said, and what is the intention behind the critique is critical in terms of how we receive it.
Great. So that's maybe a good question to take into this. How's the critique being delivered? What might Dave's intentions be? Questions for you to sit with. Who knows? I can't necessarily speak into that, but some good thoughts. Nick.
We opened with a bit of joking about the temptation once you start getting versed on kind of theories of adult development or vertical development to put people you don't like into lower forms of mind and lower stages of development as kind of like a humorous noting, like, oh, you disagree with me, I don't like you, you clearly must be lower down on the developmental hierarchy, as a kind of bias to
Yes.
kind of reflect back on.
Yes, and I think it's a good kind of tendency to very overtly engage with, because this is part of the real danger of working inside any kind of hierarchy. If you don't like the hierarchy, it must be because in some way, you know, there's different levels of privilege involved, or who belongs where. So I like that that's come up. Thanks. Libby, you also wanted to add something.
Well, we spent a lot of time on the first question, and it was really interesting what came out of that for me. And that was that we start to lose reason when we're criticized about something we're really passionate about, and that, you know, there's an emotional link to our identity that is different than maybe if we weren't so passionate. So I found that really an interesting conversation. And then I'm really curious how it relates to the next question.
So let's see how it relates to the next question as we get into it. And it's good to be aware of like how it can punch us in the gut in some way. Dave does not mince words. So people, I'm going to play you some of his direct criticism. Some of the things that he says might be personally offensive, right? And see if you can, as we get to that part of the presentation, just keep watching yourself, keep monitoring yourself, see what's happening to you as you listen to him and what he says. Anyone else sitting with an input you'd like to pop in before we move in to Dave? Yes, Jonathan.
Well, I was just going to say, I actually thought his Stairways to Heaven critique was relatively well behaved.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Yes. In the written format, he sometimes behaves better than he does in the spoken format.
Just in a short snippet. So he presents on leadership theory. It's brilliant.
Yes.
There's a mentee going up and somebody asks about adult development and leadership, and he just goes like that with his arm and says, oh, that's rubbish. And that was his response.
Oh, bless him. Okay, so who is Dave Snowden? For those of you that are not familiar with him, just a brief kind of introduction, and I will not by any means be able to do him justice. So Dave Snowden is Welsh. He's a passionate Welsh rugby supporter in many ways, and he worked for IBM in the 80s. He's been running Cognitive Edge, now called the Cynefin company. I think he's rebranded it many times. I don't always keep up, for about 20 years. And he is a real maverick. So he comes from a data science background, was involved in some AI work a long, long time ago already. And some of his methodologies are absolutely creative and genius in many ways, and are hard to always understand and follow. Part of the things that he's done, so earlier stuff that he's done, is he developed a simulation game in which he constructed let's call it a scenario in which the culture of the organization he's working with is represented to the leadership of that company as the culture of an alien planet. And then the executive group, but they're not told that it's their culture, but it's developed into heuristics that guide how this culture operates. They then asked to colonize the planet. And that whole scenario then has to do with how transformation and change initiatives into their culture works. It's a very humbling scenario. One of the things he did when he was still with IBM, when his team were in distress from a team dynamics perspective, and HR suggested that they do an MBTI intervention. It was the 80s, so the MBTI was the intervention that was done. He ran a parallel process in which he got an astrologer to pull up a team report based on the birth charts of the people in his team. He then white labeled the MBTI team report and the astrological reports and asked the team to vote on the report that was most useful for them to illuminate the team dynamics and the way forward. There was an overwhelming vote for the astrological report. And he still uses that as a very good reason why no psychometric tests or personality framework should be trusted, because astrology is clearly more useful and he doesn't believe in astrology either. So that gives you a sense of some of Dave Snowden's work. When he was with IBM, he had a protected, HR protected status as a maverick that couldn't be fired, even if he upset a whole number of people in the organization. And yeah, he's worked in things like counterterrorism. He's worked in the field of healthcare provision. He's done some very interesting things recently where he needed to write a kind of field guide for the response to the pandemic for the European Union. So he works at a very high level. And yeah, if you want to find out more things, we will make this slide deck available. There's a link to his company. As well as probably the most well-known of his articles, not by any means the only one that he's written, which is from the Harvard Business Review in 2007 called the Leaders Framework for Decision Making, in which he introduces the Cynefin model or framework. He calls his field of work sense making. Now, there are different schools of sense making work at this point in time. From Carl Weick, who was one of the first people who wrote about sense-making, to the kind of sense-making and anthropocomplexity that, or human complexity that Dave works with. And he's developed a lot of approaches. He's developed a way of assessing what's happening in an organization through micro-narratives and triangles. And there's some very interesting ways in which you can see what the next adjacent possible is from what you're doing there. So that's a little bit about Dave Snowden. If you haven't heard of him, if you're in the field of organization development, go find out more. He really knows what he's talking about. So the Cynefin model, which comes from the Welsh word that means place or habitat, is a framework that is not a 2x2 matrix, but a way of understanding the nature of systems. And it uses the nature of systems that we find in natural science to make sense of systems more broadly. And in the Cynefin framework, we start from the place here in the middle where we don't necessarily know the nature of the system we're engaging with, or we might be confused about the nature of the system we're engaging with. And as we become clear about it, we might find that we're in an ordered system. Now, this side of the framework refers to ordered systems. Now, ordered systems can be fairly simple. An analogy he uses a lot of the time is, if we live in a country where there is agreement on the rules of the road, if we drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road, that's pretty clear. We're able to go at 100 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour towards each other with the trust that we won't crash into each other because I'll stick to my side and you'll stick to your side. So he's called this domain simple or obvious or clear at different points in time. There are also some things that are ordered, but can only be understood from the perspective of a certain expertise. He calls this the complicated zone. One of our own complexity thinkers in South Africa, Paul Sillier, who used to teach at the University of Stellenbosch, used to say this is like Boeing engines. Boeing engines are quite complicated to put together, but there is a right place for every single one of the parts. And if you have the right expertise, you can put and assemble that Boeing engine. So that's the complicated domain. The complex domain, and this is where we're in the space where we're in nonlinear systems territory. The complex domain is where I cannot, even with a good amount of expertise, predict exactly how the variables will respond. Now, a lot of things in anthro-complexity are like this. We can think that the presentation I'm going to give about the new change initiative is going to inspire people. And I do everything to make it inspirational. I get all the PR people and the nicest slide deck and the most beautiful music to play. And then 7% of my workforce quits right after the presentation. So I can't really predict how it all fits together. And this is in complexity. There's non-linear relationships. So I do something small here, something big happens far away, and vice versa. Now, Paul Sillier used to say this is like making mayonnaise. You might think that you need only 12 drops of that oil, but on a given day, at a given elevation, with a given temperature and a given size of egg, you may need 17 drops of oil or 11 drops of oil, and it might still split anyway, even though you're doing everything perfectly, right? So this is like making mayonnaise from scratch, the complex domain. And chaotic domain is where there's complete breakdown in the relationship between variables. It's a state, according to Snowden. You can't stay in that for a long time. So he's not using it in some of the ways in which chaos theory is using the term chaotic. And here, once things are stabilized, they can return into a complicated, maybe clear space. Once things have gone into chaos, the recovery costs are often very expensive. Now you'll see there's a little funny squiggle here at the bottom. That indicates that there's a massive cliff between what is clear or what is obvious and what is in chaos. If I treat things that belong here in the complicated or complex domains as simple, and they're not, what often happens is that over time it goes towards this cliff edge, it falls over, and then it all falls apart and I have chaos. And the recovery from there is very expensive. So this is part of how he thinks. He thinks about systems in this way. He talks about things like assemblages and agency and how we work with that. He talks about the way in which we understand in complex systems heuristics for change, and how it's very important to understand what the ways are in which the system cannot change. So therefore, what some of the constraints are and how to work within those constraints. His main way of talking about change is to say that if we're working in a complex domain, we need to do multiple parallel experiments based on theories of what will change, not just thumb sucked in a workshop. And then we need to monitor whether those multiple probes at the same time, what the impact is on the system. And I need to make more of what's working and kill quickly what's not working. Yeah? And so that's the probes that we send into the environment. It's not one probe at a time, it's multiple probes at a time. And we need to monitor and then make more of what works and kill what doesn't work. There's a lot more we can say, but this starts giving you an idea of where Dave Snowden hangs and what he's interested in. Now, I know there might be a couple of questions here or a couple of comments. So anyone who wants to just chip in before we get to his critique. Jonathan.
Yes, could you just explain where the labels good and best came from? Are they from
Yes.
him, and in what context?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the labels of best practice, good practice, that's used in a variety of different contexts. But what he says is the idea of best practice is only valid in simple or obvious or clear domains. Yeah. The moment I start replicating best practices into complicated or complex domains, I am messing with things, because it's not as simple as just saying that you can import this practice into that environment. So he talks quite a lot about the dangers of acontextual intervention, but also even believing that best practice exists when we're in anthrocomplexity, as an example. So that's one thing. Good practice, he says, good practice exists from the particular place of the expertise that you bring in. So let's say we have an engineer and a biologist and, I don't know, a psychologist, all talking about the same field, and somehow they have something to do with this field. Each of them can bring some really valid, relevant, good practice, but none of them are right, because it's more complicated than that. So we need to find ways, and he works a lot with triage or triangle-based systems to find a way of bringing those different practices into conversation with each other. So one thing he uses is to say, as a practice, if I'm a leader and I'm in the complicated domain, I should get people with expertise from the different domains and get them to be in conversation with each other, and I'm listening to see what I can take from that. And what I'm taking from that is an amalgamation or an extrication of their multiple good practices coming together. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then, of course, in the complexity field, we're talking about emergent practice, because we have to continue probing and seeing what works and then decide on what needs to happen next, as opposed to this idea that we are planning, you know, for the next year, how this thing is going to roll out minute by minute. Don't tell the project managers about this. It will break their hearts when they realize that so much of their wonderful spreadsheets might be wasted effort. But maybe some of them know that deep, deep, deep in their hearts when they're working with complexity. Okay, so that's some Dave Snowden. Any other questions or comments? A couple of you know him, so anything else that you'd like to add in to get a sense of the man? Never drink red wine with him on a day that the Springboks are playing the Wales rugby team. It's a very bad idea. Someone's going to end up bruised and hurt.
I think he also has a passion for opera.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. And he can be intensely engaging and very generous.
Yeah.
So he's quite willing to be flexible and accommodating in many ways. But how would I say, he doesn't suffer fools.
Yes. Yes. That's a very good way to say it. A lot of the approaches that he's developed, the practices he's developed, he shares as open source. Yeah. I think he gets quite upset when people dumb them down in many different ways, but he's very open source with many of his practices. And yeah, he goes into areas like, for example, into the agile space when he was leaning into that quite a lot, from the deep place of wanting to support agile practices, and yet at the same time also critiquing, you know, safe practices and a lot of other things there. Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do next is I am not going to try and in any way be Dave Snowden. Yeah. I'm going to have you all listen to Dave speak about, and you'll just have a couple of minutes of him speaking more in general so that you can get used to how he speaks. And then he's going to roll over into a critique of adult development theory. Okay, so you're going to listen to him. We're going to listen to him for about 15 minutes, 15 minutes. So my request to you is, while you're listening to him, make notes for yourself in which you say, what am I hearing? What does this mean for me and how I work with adult development theory? or what new questions are coming up for me. But just, you know, if there's something he says that might be a little bit offensive, I'll give you an update. He might call you a faux Buddhist at some point in time. You know, just roll with it. Just see if you can hear what he's saying and stay present with it. He does speak in very dense language, as I said up front in my introduction. So this is the kind of thing that you might want to listen to a number of times to actually process. We will send out a link to some of his writing on the critique, as well as Jonathan's paper responding to that critique, which I think is a nice like kind of accompaniment to it. So we'll send that out to the group afterwards, just some links to that. But here we go. This is what Dave has to say. And just make your own notes and just keep monitoring what's happening for you. See if you can stay on the balcony. Okay, here we go. I hope in some way that he's not going to speak fast. If he does, then I'll just stop it for a second and we'll go again.
Complex and chaos, there's nothing between sense and response.
Wait. Oh no. Give me a sec. He is both speaking fast and there are funny things coming onto the screen because I loaded this a long time ago today. Give me one sec. Settings. This is just going to take a couple of seconds. Okay, let's try again. Dave, put the sound back up. Take him back a couple of seconds. I don't know if he's going to start perfectly at the point that I wanted him to start now, but we'll try again. Share screen.
And in chaos, you act sense respond. You act decisively to open up the options. So. And notice that in complex and chaos, there's nothing between sense and respond. Yeah, because you just don't have the time to do that.
Oh, sorry, people. Just deal with it. There we go.
And when it comes to sense making, what do you think are the most common mistakes or the most common things that people should know and don't?
I think there's several. One is over-reliance on black box AI. I mean, the whole move to digitization is deeply problematic at the moment, partly because nobody's paying attention to the training data sets. I remember at a conference in Washington 20 years ago when I was starting the DARPA work, and I was sat on a platform with John Poindexter, who used to be Reagan's national security advisor. I didn't know who he was until I decided I liked him. Then I discovered who he was, and I wasn't meant to like him, so that got a bit confused for a bit. And somebody asked us what we thought about AI, and this is 20 years ago. We were heavily working on counterterrorism. This is all around 9/11. And both of us said the problem is the training data sets. And I'd worked on AI for years before that. Now, nobody believed us, but if you now look at the Scholastic Parrots paper from the Google employees, everybody understands that's an issue. So there's a body of sense making which is about data analytics, which actually doesn't pay sufficient attention, to training data sets, and also over relies on written text, which is about 10% of what humans know anyway. So I think that's one problem. I think the other problem is where people do too much on the inductive case-based side. So about 99% of management textbooks are very similar. I studied these 8, 10, 15 companies over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months. I observed they all have this quality which you think is desirable, and they all did these things. Therefore, if you do these things, you too will have the desirable property. That's called the confusion of correlation with causation. Yeah, and sometimes that's legitimate. So, for example, Good to Great, which was a major textbook. Yeah? But if you look at it, I remember the first time I read it, and I said, "But you've chosen the apex predators. So you've chosen companies who are the first to establish a market. Well, they survive no matter how incompetent they are." So there's a much simpler explanation if you understand ecological life systems. And then you get some really bad books. So there's one called Lean Startup, where the guy goes and studies or interviews a series of people he knows who ran successful Silicon Valley startups and identify things they do. Publishes a best-selling book. Well, when I was in IBM, we did a similar study with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard, and we found that all companies who failed did the same things as the company who succeeded. It's just you had a market, so some people are bound to fail, and some people are bound to succeed. So that's another bad book, and probably the worst of all time is Lacroix's Reinventing the Organization. Yeah, where he's actually got a religious fervor around the style of organization he would like. I mean, he also gets into the spiral dynamics nonsense. He said he has jade because everybody in spiral dynamics has to have a new color so they can do it that way. And he only selects partial evidence from his own cases to support the proposition. Yeah? And that sort of thing in management books is really dangerous. It's really bad science, and it's really dangerous for companies.
Yeah, I was going to come to your attitude to developmental thinking. You mentioned, is it Philippe Lacroix, the author of that book, Reinventing Organizations? Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people who were heavily influenced by that, who tried to kind of use some of the lessons in their company and generally weren't successful. It didn't work. So yeah, broadly speaking, developmental thinking, we're talking kind of spiral dynamics, Ken Wilber's work, and I know a lot of people have tried to apply it to kind of businesses and failed. And I know you're quite skeptical about the whole idea of developmental thinking.
Actually, fairly antagonistic, to be honest. I think it's morally dubious. I mean, Nora Bateson and I are having a lot of fun on social media on this at the moment. We're both going for it, which people didn't expect, right? So I think there are several things. First of all, you've got legitimate ends and non-legitimate ends. But if you go back to adult maturity models and things like Keegan, again, that goes back to original research from Piaget, which has been disproved. People have tried to replicate the experiments and not got the same results. And that's a real problem with a lot of this stuff, certainly the psychological approaches. And the idea that children go through stages, we can measure maturity. There are issues about brain plasticity, there are things like that. But you can't take that sort of physical development and then apply it to people's social ability. I'm quite interested in taking Kagan's stages and making them modulators in a complex system. i.e. they will have different influences in different contexts, and then that I think is quite powerful, right? But the step stuff, consultants like that too much because it privileges the person. There's almost this weird thing is, I've got a maturity model, that means I'm mature and you're not, and I'll take you through. At the extreme, that's where spiral dynamics went. You know, if you look at spiral dynamics, the original research is very culturally specific, and the guy did it on his own students in a very limited, unstructured way. So you can't from that generalize to a world pattern, right? It then gets picked up by Beck and Cohen, right? And Cohen probably more authentic than Beck. Beck ends up with Wilbur and John from Arlington Institute and the Turquoise Institute. Sorry, I know this stuff backwards, right? And they then create this highly progressive things in which you are at different stages, right? And I still remember when they created the Turquoise Institute, I was at an event, shall we say, and I got told that I couldn't possibly discuss it with them because I was an angry green and I hadn't reached the turquoise state of enlightenment. So I had badges made that night, proud to be brown, and got everybody to wear them. And of course, brown isn't a colour, and they didn't get it, so they had no ironic sense of humour. I think there are two or three dangers here. One is techniques which come sideways from therapy are always dangerous in organizations because they assume people need therapy and they privilege the therapist. And stage-based models are even more dangerous because they privilege an imagined future state. And they don't realize that in different contexts, we can all play different things. So if you take the tennis at the moment, we've got an 18-year-old displaying more maturity than most adults in the context of tennis, but that wouldn't mean I trust her with a nuclear weapon. You know, it's this context-free thing, which is another problem with it.
And you mentioned Keegan, so Robert Keegan from Harvard. He's got a sort of a stage model as well. Are you saying that you don't think there's any underlying phenomena that they're picking up, or you just think it's dangerous?
No, I'm actually saying at that end, I think that's interesting. I just think it's not linear. So I'm playing around with using his stages, not as stages, but as modulators. So modulators is a complexity concept. The way I describe it is you've got magnets, which can change in polarity and strength, and then you've got iron discs in the table. So if all the magnets keep the same polarity and strength, stable pattern, if they all change, the patterns are unstable. So in different contexts it will work. So I think the Keegan stuff has got research behind it. It's got this fundamental flaw, and it's based on Piaget, who's been challenged significantly, but there's still value in it. So I can do something with that. right? But treating it as modulators. Spiral dynamics, after Wilbur got involved, became a cult. And it's an esoteric cult, and I call it faux Buddhism. And I think that's just dangerous.
Google Digital Skills for Africa offers.
Okay. So that's as far as we go. So apologies for maybe I've been watching too many YouTube videos. Keep being told to brush my teeth better. Yeah, so that's some of what Dave Snowden was saying in a podcast called Rebel Wisdom. If you're interested in that, interesting people that speak on that. And I like to listen to it. So yeah, what we're going to do is I'm going to just pop you into breakouts for a moment to talk about what did I hear? What landed for me? Maybe even what activated me. We'll do smaller groups. I'm going to mostly do groups of 3, and yeah, see what pops into that. We maybe heard different things at different points in time. So let me start some breakouts. There we go. Okay, so off you go into your breakouts. You're with new people, and once again, we'll just chat for about 15 minutes, 15, and then we'll have the larger conversation in the group. So what did I hear? What does that mean for me and my practice with adult development theory?
Libby, I told you my head wasn't working very well. I saw the button and I clicked it. Sorry about that.
Okay, so welcome back in the big room. Let's hear some thoughts. And here we're not looking for feedback, but really what themes did you hear? What really struck you? And just work with it a little bit. There's something about being witnessed as you work a critique that I think is really relevant and valid. So whoever wants to jump in and be brave and share some of what's landed for you or what you've heard in the pattern of the conversation in the group. Jump in here.
I'll just jump in very quickly that one of the things that Dave brought up that I appreciate is the lack of contextual application. That context does matter.
Yeah.
But I don't agree necessarily that it invalidates everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we see this with a lot of different frameworks that we work with. This idea of the moment we go into things contextually, whether it's adult development or some kind of, let's call it, here's an example, Japanese style manufacturing process that gets dropped into a small factory in the middle of the Northwest province in South Africa. There's a lot of things we do acontextually, and often those acontextual things are incredibly dangerous. Yeah. Does it invalidate it? No, not necessarily, but very valid. Jonathan.
I think one thing is it's so much easier to have a simple theory. And often the theories are laid out as though they're simple because it's easier to understand. But then people who actually use the theories eventually decide, wait a minute, it does depend on context and it is more nuanced along some sort of continuum. And so to treat it as though it is just one thing and therefore it invalidates it seems problematic.
Yeah.
And in terms of context, we were talking about how we tend to show up in traffic situations when there are drivers getting in our way, and the idea of center of gravity and how we can shift. And so one of the questions was, if you think about centers of gravity and being able to flex forward and fall back, how different is that from the idea of modulators?
Yeah. Well, there's a really good question. So, I mean, if we really go into a stage model and we reify the stages as boxes, right? That's a very different way of working with a stage model in the way that you've just said, Jonathan, which is a center of gravity at a point in time. And I'd add to that, within a particular context. A center of gravity at a point in time within a particular context. And then something that I think is starting to come up in parts of the adult development theory world, this idea of also talking about range. What is my range at this point in my life, which is very different from creating little boxes and popping people in there. Now, some of us may have really, really, really violent reactions to being put in little boxes, regardless of what that box says. You know, it might be a personality style, it might be a competency or a quality or a stage, who knows? But, you know, I think for many of us, we don't like to be put into little boxes. Does that mean that being in a relationship with a framework is necessarily going to put you in a box, or that that's the only way to work with it? Obviously not. I do want to come at it from a different angle to the things start out simple, and then we figure out that it becomes more nuanced. And I know that this is something that I also got, Jonathan Reams, from your paper, this idea of sometimes what happens is the framework and model is actually quite nuanced. But because as human beings, we can't hold all the complexity in the world in our brains all the time. What we do is we kind of chip away some of the edges and turn it into simple things so that we can cognitively, emotionally cope with it. Yeah. And I know that Dave can hold a massive amount of complexity around a lot of his sense making and anthropocomplexity frameworks and processes. I'm wondering what would happen if he were to hold the complexity of adult development theory in a more nuanced way, rather than chipping away at the edges in some kind of way. And I think this is something we do as practitioners when we present some of these adult development stage theories as well, is we might go and say, meet the client where they're at. So we have to, this is now, I'm going to use very judgmental language, because this is how we fall into the trap of privileging ourselves as adult development practitioners or academics. We go, let's dumb it down so that we can meet them where they're at. And in the very dumbing it down, we're creating little boxes, which is not the intention of adult development theory or the Enneagram or whatever. There's lots of different frameworks that we share here. But we're dumbing it down in that way. The second thing is we are withholding, it's a form of infantilization. Because if we make everything dumbed down, so we meet people where they're at, that means that people don't have to wrestle and grapple with the ambiguity and complexity that it offers itself, which in and of itself is a developmental practice. So there is something about being very aware of the assumptions that we make in how we bring these things and making sure that we don't end up dumbing down whatever framework you're working with. So obviously we need to meet people in a sensible place. And we need to trust that humans are infinitely resourceful and capable of dealing with complexity and grappling with it in the ways that they are ready to grapple with it. And that it's not my job to be the censor that kind of cuts off the corners, if that makes sense. So that's, yeah, maybe I'm sharing some of my thoughts around this. Let's hear one or two other perspectives. Pat.
Yeah, I heard a couple of times, and also Dave Snowden saying dumbing down. Is that the same thing as making something more simpler so people can apply it?
What's your own response to that?
That's what I do. And if it's called dumbing down, I'm fine with the language. But there seems some judgmental there that I don't agree with.
Yeah. So I think they're two different things. The first thing is working with things in a way that make them practically applicable. When theory and practice comes together in that space that's praxis, I'm able to work with it in a way that makes me do stuff with it. That in and of itself is an absolute gift. And I think there are a lot of people that are good on practical, and there are a lot of people that are good on theory, but bringing things into praxis where it's not just practice for its own sake, but practice informed by theory in a simple way that we can move forward, that's an absolute gift. I think that's the opposite of dumbing down. It's exquisite skill. Then at the same time, there is a way in which sometimes we can go, oh, this group, you know, I can only give them 5% of what this, so let's just make it simple, not so that we can do stuff with it, but because in some unconscious or conscious way, there's a judgment that goes, they can't handle the truth. You know, they're not ready for it all. Instead of figuring out how do I bring a process that honors the complexity and makes it accessible. That's the skill. You know, I'm not making it complex for its own sake. I'm developing a process that takes you into it so that it can be an exploration rather than a shutting down. When it shuts people down, that's often the dumbing down bit. Yeah. Yeah. Other things that came up in your small group discussions, or maybe that you're sitting with here that you didn't have time for in terms of the critique. Christu.
I think what you mentioned, I saw originally when Dave and Nora were going at ego development on Twitter, etc. And although I felt there was some validity in the critique, I also felt it was a straw man, that it was carefully constructed and ready. And I just read through Jonathan's article, and I saw Jonathan also rebuts some of the points around the genesis of spiral, and also some of the points around Piaget. So one would hope that there would be a little bit more of a deeper engagement around what the theory offers. Something that I found interesting, that was different, and it's just a point that I heard him say before, is the one around therapy and bringing things from the psychotherapeutic domain into organizations, and the question of privileging the therapist. And I wonder if that to some extent is also just a straw man or a worst case. And if that is a sort of a blanket caution against the therapeutic mode. Because I don't think that I agree with that. I think a lot of things are therapeutic. I think philosophy is therapeutic. I think a whole range of things outside psychotherapy is therapeutic. I think to a certain extent, much what happens in society is therapeutic and needs to be therapeutic. So that was just an interesting point. But yes, I can see this point around the privileging of the therapist or the consultant or the facilitator or etc. And in a way, I also think that the ego development model or the approach, the general approach to the work, if it is a well-wrought approach, then that's one of the issues that it explicitly deals with. Is the position of the facilitator or the consultant or the therapist, the terrible thing, therapist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Christu, I think you and I have been in similar conversations where the whole conversation around health and effectiveness in organizations have been at stake with Dave and with others around, you know, what is the place for the conversation around health inside the organizational context and how we work with that. I have heard Dave in other forums say things like, don't get me wrong, I'm not against therapy. I think there is a place for it. I just have a problem with therapeutic models inside organizations. So I've heard him say that. I have also heard him say, begrudgingly, I will give it to some that they have had benefits from a Tavistock-based approach. It's not me, but maybe some people have benefited from that. And I've heard them say it, so they must know their own lived experience. So Just to put that into, I think, broader context of some other stuff that he said over time. But he does have an issue with bringing the therapeutic into, and specifically, I think, psychodynamic models. He does say a lot of things about Tavistock approaches inside organizations. So we're not only critiquing adult development theory, but a whole lot of other things too. Yeah, but thanks for bringing that perspective in. What is therapeutic?
Yeah, and I can understand also from sort of the neoliberal approach to therapeutic is like fix the individual, etc., etc. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the healing of the collective, which is something very different.
Yeah. And I think I'll get to you now in a moment, Alistair. I think that's part of where there is a really valuable part to what Dave Snowden is saying. So in general, he speaks a lot about the overemphasis, the problem with the overemphasis of the individual and atomistic approach. And having to really look at the interactions, the patterns between people as being the place for intervention. Now, if we work with stages as modulators in interactions in collectives, what might that look like? Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. There's a couple of other comments we'll get, but we start thinking about that. If we were to use stages as modulators in interactions in collectives, what might that look like? Alistair.
Thanks. I've had the privilege of 3 weeks or so of doing homework on this guy. I was part of the Coaches Rising annual summit, where he had a session and he was just, saying what he wants to say about adult development. So based on my understanding of that Cook-Greuter model, right? Dave's languaging sits on that specializing performer stage. He's just referencing models. I think if you watch it, the recordings are still available, I think. He's just quoting models upon models. Cynefin itself is a model. That's a trait of a specializing performer kind of stage of development. And why am I saying this? Even using adult development scales as a framework is also kind of specialized. There's a paradox there. But why I'm saying this is you have to engage with someone at their stage of development, right? So, for example, he's saying that therapeutic models are not for the workplace. Integrating feelings, etc., into your being is a level 5 trait. So he's not there yet. And I think what needs to happen is, first of all, meet him where he's at and hold that stage with compassion. In English, they say even a broken clock is right twice a day or something like that. So there are some valid points he makes, and some invalid as well. But in summary, I think it's critical to just understand what stage he's coming from in terms of his languaging. I haven't put him through the system. I haven't tested him. But his languaging speaks a lot about somebody who's looking at things from that performing, specializing stage. And even his title, if you see on YouTube, his videos, like Head of Science, etc., etc. And even the intro you gave today, it's a history of a very good specialist. And it's a blessing, right? And then also now speaking from an Enneagram 7 perspective, I've tried to connect the two models, Suzanne's and the Cynefin model. They're pretty much the same model, right? Because if you look at that bottom right quadrant, the order one, that's an early stage sort of way of thinking. And as you go up to more complex chaos stuff, that's the stuff somebody who's integrated more into their being, operates from. So those are the two connections I made from the model, both models. And I think there just needs to be more of a chorus in the coaching community to say, I think we're all talking about the same thing. We've chopped it up differently. Because if you look at the meaning of what he says, the meaning of Cynefin is in terms of habitat, that's where he talks about stuff like different scenarios, right? And that's the stuff therapy covers, right? So has he understood the Cynefin model? What it really means. And Julia in the training, she used to say, there's a difference between knowing and knowing. So if your theory is not being matched by your words or your actions, then I'm like, what's going on here? So my last word is just to invite everyone to watch that Coaches Rising video interview he had and match his languaging to any stage on Suzanne's scale and see where he lands up. That's what I did. I don't know what you find out, but I find him at those two centers of gravity, somewhere there.
Thanks, Alistair.
Can I share a few thoughts?
Yes, you can. I just want to share one or two, and then I'll give to you. So, Alistair, I think the first thing that I would just invite is I think there's many perspectives on this, but I think the cautionary note that I'd bring is that we can fall into the very trap that that Dave speaks of, and that is the trap of privileging the practitioner. And just to be very cautious of this idea of in some way saying, okay, well, I mean, the fact that he's critiquing this must mean that he comes from an earlier stage is a very dangerous ground to be on.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
I'm actually graded on the specializing phase. So
yeah,
it takes one to know one, you know. So I'm not, I just know my people. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. So just still hold that lightly. Hold that lightly. Hold that very lightly. Jonathan.
Hi, everybody. I joined a bit late today, so I didn't have a chance to participate in the opening conversation. But to me, it very much goes back to the question, what is critique? What is critique? And to me, the alternative that was alluded to, but it wasn't named, I think, in the early discussion that I heard, was the difference between critique and dismissal. And I think that critique requires a level of nuance and actually making the case, not just saying something like, what was one of the things? I mean, a bit the straw man kind of argument that I think you alluded to, Jonathan. You know, well, that's bad because it creates a hierarchy, and we might, as the holders of the keys of the system, we're then going to beat our clients over the head with it, and implied maybe some economic interest or otherwise. Well, that's a possibility. But that doesn't undermine the whole system. That just means there's a risk out there and there's a danger, and we should note that and have a checklist and try and be reflective and make sure we're not doing that. That doesn't undermine the system. So it's really, to me, fuzzy thinking. And then de facto, it becomes actually a method of dismissal. The straw man, I love the term, rather than actually a nuanced, coherent critique, a series of arguments and thoughts, and marshalling some evidence, which I thought you did do, Alistair, actually, in the way that you described what you said. So I'm a bit hesitant to what you said, Lucille, about to holding that lightly. I think it's a risk that we do, and it was well mentioned by him, but it doesn't undermine the system. And when someone like Alistair actually made the case, he took responsibility for his communication and to make his point, not just I think this, but why, and actually walk me through the thought process. That to me is critique. And I didn't find his Snowden.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I didn't find his comments actual critique. I found them concerns or, specific points where something could be true. That doesn't mean it's always true. means it could be true, and they could be true. They're all things that could be true. So and it's to me, it's ironic because his system is precisely one that requires a whole range of people who can operate in different actual demands. If he's right, and I love his system, I love his work, by the way, I think it's incredibly insightful. And if our world is one that has these different kinds of realities, then we actually need people who can manage and help and lead and support and whatever with the different kinds of capacities. And then he's the one who comes and says, no, because actually, if he's correct, if the whole field of adult development is left, then we should all just resign and look for other jobs. Because he's actually saying the implied thing which he doesn't state is all of this is nonsense. Everyone's okay. Everyone's got a different kind of way of being in the world. Just get on with it. So, anyway, that's.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for bringing that in, and a counter perspective to what I offered as well to Alistair. Thanks. Jonathan.
Yeah, a couple of things listening to what Jonathan said. I mean, and I wrote in the chat, when I think of what I listened to from Alistair, I thought it was more of an analysis than a critique. It is taking, data and analyzing it against a lens or framework. And I have made similar conclusions from having those conversations. But there are other lenses through which I believe Dave's discourse would rate higher in like models of hierarchical complexity or things like that.
Yes.
So it depends upon the lens, and that's what analysis does. You take a lens and you do stuff with it. But also in relation to what Jonathan was saying, so part of my understanding of Dave through direct experience and through talking with the person who got me to write that reflection, Dave is an empiricist. And that has implications for what you count as valid data.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ego development models, you see, they move towards a more transcendent or spiritual kind of teleos. Whether you talk about Francis Vaughan, the inward arc, or Suzanne's model, or any of these, there is something that tries to say there's something more to life and does not filter out and judge everything according to empirical data only. And I think then you have a collision of epistemological foundations from which you're looking at and judging things coming into conflict.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point to say, what is the epistemological ground that the arguments are coming from? I mean, part of what Dave offers is anything that has transcendence as the top of the hierarchy is foul Buddhist nonsense. Yeah. And so where does the transcendent, the spiritual, whatever you want to call it in some way, where does that way of knowing and being in the world fit into a very empirical way of looking at the world? Yeah, it's a good question. Any other thoughts, comments, questions into the space? Okay, so what I'd love for us to play with then, if we can hold multiple things at the same time, the one being a relationship with adult development theory, and the other a critique and an offering into the adult development theory space. Yeah. So the question here would be, he says, I'm playing with the idea of using stages as modulators, and then he talks about the different magnets and the iron discs, that part. So using stages as modulators into the interactions between people in a system. Yeah. What does that look like? What does he mean? We are unzipping that file here together. What do you think he means when he says use the stages as modulators? Anyone with any thoughts, ideas, examples? And you can, I mean, this is supervision space, so you can figure it out as you speak.
But to me, this is so clear and the epitome of this kind of self-contradiction. What he's describing is how I understand spiral dynamics.
Yes.
How
Say more,
Graves-
Jonathan.
Well, how Graves, when I did Don Beck's training 20 years ago, and what I understood is they're talking about cultural memes that we live within and live within us that come out more or less in different contexts. So they modulate our experience, performance, values, and so on. So sounds like he's describing spiral dynamics.
Love to be there for the conversation when that plays out. So any other, and I'll draw on Pat's suggestion here, like taking those very theoretical words and figuring out how to use them, how to make that idea of modulators practical. Any ideas on how we do that? Jonathan.
I'll take a stab at it. I think if we think of it in terms of different lenses we can use and think about how accessible are they to us in different situations and what leads us to use one versus another, then we can try to help people shift from a lens that makes them right, for example, to a lens that might help them see the potential validity of a different perspective. And one of the things I do is couples therapy. And if we can't do that at all when working with a couple, then we should just stop doing couples therapy.
Yeah. I mean, as you were describing it, what kind of arose for me as an analogous way of working with something would be, I'm sorry, Dave, if you can hear me, Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, people. Like, what if we took the stages and put them on as thinking hats and made them obvious in the interactions and say, okay, we are putting this thinking hat on in how we would talk about this decision we're about to make that we've been stuck in and fighting about in our executive team. I'm wondering about that. So that's the idea of modulators. In some way, we become more deliberate. We make it obvious. We play in some way into a frame. Now, this is very different to saying you're at an early stage, you don't have access to this. So just note that that's the difference. That's the difference in using the stage as a privileging some rather than others. To say, how do we evoke this in the system right now? We might be interventionist and therapeutic here. So maybe if we're Dave, we're saying, can we skip generation someone to evoke this in the system now? I don't know. He often works with skip generation. So we'll get the young ones to come and evoke a different stage of maturity in the conversation. But that idea of modulators is that if we offer it into the conversation, into the decision-making, and that's, I mean, what he does with Cynefin, his main article, A Leader's Framework for Decision-Making, you know, what we might get is, in fact, something that's similar to a probe sense respond versus, you know, an act sense respond, whatever it is. There's different ways in which that might play out. So that's one way of using them as modulators. Other ways, anything else that's come up? Any other ideas?
Lucille, I'm struggling with the idea of qualities, capabilities that are intrinsic or emerge from a person or a system, and qualities we can induce at will in a person or a system. It seems to me those are, at least in general, different things, or should be different things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm in no means able to channel Dave, but one of the things that he would say potentially into the space is the fact that you're thinking of qualities is where the challenge starts here. Yeah. Because the obsession with qualities is part of the atomistic view of things. So even if we're talking qualities of a system, okay, now we're in dangerous territory because systems thinking is also one of the things that he likes to critique quite extensively. But let's just go an individual quality as opposed to thinking of the modulators as practices. So in his kind of world, he would say, if you think about a practice that evokes something in a certain context, you might try to evoke it. In another context, it might not work. If it works, you could do more of that. But it's about practices rather than qualities.
Okay, but a person or a system still needs to be able to support those. I mean, you mentioned the example of dropping a Japanese manufacturing philosophy into a Northwest Cape factory. Which one can almost guess beforehand is unlikely to work very well. How does one guess that?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the core thing here is to maybe pull back into micro practices that can be worked with more experimentally than massive systems. Yeah. But really to go back to and to interpose them in the way in which we interact with each other, as opposed to a really large behemoth of a practice, as opposed to micro experimentation. Dave's thinking is always you can use it as a modulator to take you to the next adjacent possible, which is like, I'm not taking you from small factory in this province to Japanese style management, but I'm looking at what the next adjacent possible is that may be moving us towards a different way of having the conversation, as opposed to a different quality that's inherent in me. I don't know if that's particularly useful.
I'm now also thinking that this distinction that Wilbert makes between states and stages, and that if you could generate states, and we do generate states, don't we? We generate states all the time. Sometimes we take mushrooms and we generate states. Sometimes we dance, and sometimes we have a conversation for an hour and we generate a different kind of a state. If that could give the kind of access that Rikus talks about, that even if it's a temporary access, that you suddenly have and it's a kind of a collective access. It's not just individual. It's not just the people who are at individual what's it called, internalizing or strategizing. It's not just those people. Suddenly other people also have access to that space. And I know it's skirting dangerously close to the privileged therapist guru type of person who transmits a certain vibe into which others can. But I do think there's a certain space in which we can make collective state shifts, in which we can explore different possibilities, even if we return to a different center of gravity.
That idea of the elastic experience in some way. And I guess I was thinking when you were listing the things of evoking states, I'm like, you could put up a very long PowerPoint with very detailed graphics and elicit a certain state as well, which we quite often do in systems. But the core thing here has to do with, it's not necessarily me atomistically evoking a state in you atomistically. It is about the interaction that we focus on, rather than I am evoking the state in you because I am a late stage guru or mentor. I think I can't remember what the words in Nick Petrie's one paper is. You know, interact with a late stage guru, late stage mentor. Okay, is a way in which part of what vertical development is about can be packaged. So it's not about that, but it's about the interaction that creates the elastic experience. Be maybe a different way of thinking about it. Yeah. I think the one thing that is important to take quite seriously from Dave's work is this critique of, if we're going to use a case-based evidence, either for individual leader work or for organizational systems work, and we're going to say, let's create the teal organization. Here are the 7 steps. So we can already from an adult development lens see the problems with this, right? Here are the 7 things you need to do to enable a teal organization. And here are the 7 cases where I've maybe construed correlation and causation in different ways that I'm now transplanting, like my Japanese management system, into the Central African Republic, into Germany, into Chile, and into Australia at the same time in an acontextual way, I am going to get in trouble. Yeah. So just to note that, you know, I think whether you're a fan of Laloux's work or not, there's an interesting perspective there. Okay. Anyone else with some thoughts and inputs into the space? I'll just pop some of his critique on there. Yeah, and just see if there's anything else that you want to share into the larger space. This is, I think some of the things that I've read in his writing, much more than in what he was speaking, is, and Dave can be very specific about language, and he believes that it's useful for us to keep moving language if we want to make sure that it doesn't get stereotyped or used inappropriately. And so in many ways, adult development theory has moved the language. One of the words that's come in the last couple of years, maybe mostly from Suzanne's side, is this idea of vertical development. But this idea that the language of vertical development can create an implicit assumption that horizontal development's bad and vertical development is good. And so that's something that I think is interesting, to just be aware of our language. Jonathan.
Well, I mean, I also critique that distinction because I understand why people use it, but I also see the problems it creates. But what I was noticing on that list was the thing about Piaget. Yes. And one of the things I came across this summer was a neuroscience book that actually referenced Piaget. And what they said was, while Piaget's stages he said they appeared earlier than Piaget noted them. There was evidence neurologically for them, but in the kind of sequence, so they were acknowledging that Piaget was onto something. They just could recognize it in children even earlier. So his timing of the stages was not necessarily accurate. Yeah.
And I think, you know, that's a very good point. So to just say we dismiss everything because it's built on Piaget's theory is quite problematic, because as much as science improves over time, you know, we correct some things, we find out that that works in a similar way, but maybe not exactly, the timing's out. There's a lot of Piaget's work that in different ways hold ground. It's just that if you draw a very narrow boundary around Piaget's work and say, is this absolutely true? The answer is no. But that could be true of a lot of different things.
It depends upon how you understand it, how you contextualize it, how you modernize it and bring it forward. So, yeah.
So we're back in the same argument again around, are we oversimplifying and straw manning things in inappropriate ways? The other Jonathan.
And along similar lines, I'm really curious about this idea about how it is bad to bring in ideas from therapy when therapy is such a broad universe of people practicing quite differently from one another. Again, it's nice to make a simple comment, but what exactly is it? You know, there are lots of therapists who don't diagnose, who don't pathologize, who make very different assumptions from one another. So what exactly are we potentially bringing in that's bad?
Yeah. And there are behaviorists and there are Rogerians and there are, I mean, and behaviorism is in many ways like some forms of organizational intervention that's very anti-therapeutic, if that can be a useful term to use there. Yeah. So in terms of this, I think it's really useful to know what some of the critiques, criticism, maybe dismissals are out there. In our capacity to engage with it and to hold it alongside our passion for a field, we are broadening our ability to be in the space of what I think it was John Vervaeke that I heard refer to the estuary recently. It may have been someone else, so apologies if it's a wrong mention here. But the idea of the estuary is the place where the seawater and the freshwater meet, but we're not trying to convert each other. So what is the space where we can be in the field together and have interesting conversations and enrich our understanding of our world and what we're doing without needing to convert or convince someone who has different beliefs? So for me, that's a really nice way of thinking about how to be with different critiques of different aspects of our work. May not just be adult development theory. Where do we meet in the estuary? There's so much in the political sphere that's pushing people into separate camps and to into antagonistic relationship with each other. And so I think that's happening in all parts of the world where we kind of separating out. And actually there's something beautiful about what emerges when we can be in the space together without needing to take on each other's ideas, but still being open-hearted and influenced by that and being able to bring our listening. So I know in my earlier years, I've had my back up in relation to Dave. And we've had our moments. And I'm quite enjoying the opportunity of being with some of his critique in a way that feels like it can be an estuary meeting place. I'm not sure what it feels like for him. I'm not sure what game he's playing when he's busy on Twitter with Nora or, you know, going at it in the Coaches Rising space, you know, entering enemy territory and having a blow up, whatever he wants to think about. I don't know where he's at in relation to this. There is a chance that he might just be playing a very provocative game, which I don't necessarily put outside of the realms of possibility. What I do appreciate is something inside me that's different to what it has been before in how I have been able to work with this critique. And I guess inside that, there's something of a lived experience that validates my relationship with adult development. Because I know that I haven't always been able to be in the estuary. And I've been in a place where I've been willing to throw bombs the other way. And I don't know what that's worth, but I do know that it feels different and it's inside this body. And I am going to privilege a little bit of my own lived experience in terms of making sense of how it feels to be in relation to the critique. I like some of the ideas around being playful. I don't know how all of the modulation stuff will play out like Rickers. Maybe it's impossible because I'm trying to draw on qualities that are not present in the system. I don't know. But I know that this is evoking some new possibilities for me. And that idea of working with a center of gravity or a range at a point in time in a specific context is a beautiful way of, maybe, for me at least, bringing some framing into that feels enabling as a constraint rather than a box that's limiting. So I'll invite 2 or 3 people to maybe just check out for us around, what am I taking from this and from this conversation, and what's played out here, or maybe even just what's happened inside you and in your body. We'll do 3 comments and then we're going to close down supervision for today. Yeah. So what have you noticed, or what are you taking from this conversation? A little balcony moment. I'm keen to hear from some of the people that have been quite quiet. Helena, how lovely to hear from you. What are you taking from this?
I love the analogy of the estuary moment. I think that is a light bulb moment for me of how things can come together in an estuary, and also what a creative ecosystem that can be. And I like the idea of that interplay of ideas and the playfulness of it without trying to win or convert.
Thanks, Helena. 2 more checkouts. What are you taking from this conversation? What have you noticed in yourself as we've been engaging with this? Ingrid.
I'm very grateful for this opening of the idea of modulators, like using this theory, this body of knowledge in that way, in a relational way, and not essentializing it, or like you were speaking about the reification of stages. And you know, I tend to have a very ambivalent relationship with models as kind of colonizing discourses, as I mentioned to you in the email the other day, where there's anything descriptive and normative, I'm instantly finding ways how to work with it in a way that isn't, or you know, so that thing of the thinking hats in way of working with ways of thinking, ways of being with oneself. I find that really helpful, because then the discourse for me becomes about, this work is about opening a new range of possibilities for us, of being in ourselves, with each other. And it's got no hierarchical judgment or normativity in it, really. It's got a, I suppose, like just an emancipatory ethos that I like.
Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks for bringing that perspective. And let's hear from, we're doing things Dave style, triangles, magical third. Who else would like to bring in a closing thought, provocation, noticing? And it doesn't have to be profound or deep. It can just be a noticing. And it can be profane if we're inverting the idea of sacred and profane and not going for transcendence. In
that case.
Anastasia.
Thank you. No, it's the second time I'm joining the supervision sessions with Aephoria, and I'm just so euphoric about it. I mean, this is just such a nice place to be. You know, Lucille, when you started, you said this would be, so you were trying to caution us that now the big bad guy is coming or something is going to happen. So be prepared. And And it's been such a great experience. You guys are so nice, and you together you're creating such a wonderful space where critique doesn't feel like critique. I wonder what it was, but it was something else. And Lucille, just the way you are facilitating and bringing and holding this, and the way you're bringing in yourself. I'm looking at your face. Your tan skin and the cheeks and the eyes are. It's just so genuine. It's just so nice. So I am just full of gratitude to all of you, and to you, Lucille, in particular, for this 2 hours. This is a true spirit of, whatever you call it, supervision sounds wrong for what I've experienced today.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, and it's been lovely to have you in the space for a second time. So, without much further ado, people, thank you for coming to this conversation. May the estuary be fertile for you wherever you go from here, and we'll share some of the resources, Jonathan Ream's article, some of Dave's articles, and a recording of the supervision. Yes, and look out for our notices on what happens next. Go well, have a beautiful day, evening, whatever is next in your time zone. Bye.
Bye.